name is Mary Daniels, and I am a failed Goodist. Now, I know the word Goodist doesn't really exist, but a dear friend of mine who lives in Italy nicknamed me that, because every time we caught up on the phone, I was off doing some other crazy project. See, a Goodist feels this deep desire, this burning need to be good and do good, which sounds okay on the outside, except it's normally wrapped up with our sense of identity, our sense of worth, this need to feel that we have some purpose, some reason to exist. So my Goodism took on all shapes and forms. I'd be joining a cause, starting a movement, registering so many domains I could hardly afford the fees every month. I'd be putting stuff up on Facebook. I felt that I needed to raise awareness, raise the consciousness of the planet. I was running around doing so many things that I thought was good work. It was being a good person. And on the outside, people would call me things like a change maker, mover and shaker, an activist. No, a sacred activist, a spiritualist, a hippie, a Buddhist. But on the inside, I was just exhausted, totally burnt out, completely ineffective, and all I seemed to be doing is helping other failed Goodists. So, reflecting on this, I suddenly asked myself, how did you end up here? I mean, 1 minute you were living in London, running around, doing Goodism so badly, you decided to move to the country, where 3 months later you also burnt out trying to be a Goodist. So something needed to stop. Something needed to change. I remember one day I was on the phone to my friend, and I call her a friend, but she's like a mentor and a guide. And I think she's had amusement over the years watching me spin round and round in circles. And she said to me, Mary, do you know what? Why can't you accept that you are perfect and enough just the way you are? Why do you believe this world needs fixing? What if the world is not broken? I took that on board because she is wise, and then the but came. And the but came because I was looking at this world we were living in, and it felt and seemed far from perfect. It seemed that how could we sit here and watch what was going on environmentally, what was going on with our young people, what was going on with people on the other side of the world that felt like they were so disconnected but were desperate for a home and somewhere to feel safe? How could we say this was not a broken world? But I knew, something in me knew, that deep down inside she was right. So I started to retrace where this Goodism came from. And I realized that it's actually been hardwired into my DNA. At school, it was all about do good, be good. We were shown images of Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Gandhi, Maya Angelou. This is what good looked like. My goodness, I thought. It was about getting the grades, because if you got the grades, you got into the good university. And if you got into the good university, then the chances are you'd have a good career. And if you had a good career, the chances are you'd be able to afford a good home, in a good area, with a good man or a good woman, in a good catchment area for your good babies. So that was what the Goodism journey was about, because then we could recreate the good hell for our children. And it was going on and on and on. At home, my journey with good and bad was completely different. When I was 3 weeks old, I had been fostered, and by the time I was about 4 or 5, my parents decided to take me back. Now, I was a chatty, curious, bossy, stubborn, didn't take no for an answer young girl. Very different to how I am today, but that was me. And I was too much for my parents, just simply too much. They had come from the background where you only spoke when you were spoken to, and you did exactly what you were told the second you were told to do it. So having Mary land on their doorstep, they were in this dilemma. I grew up knowing that I was the naughty one, labelled as the bad child. And it got to the point where some of my father's threats would be, if you continue this way, one day you'll end up in hospital and I'll end up in jail, meaning I don't know what's going to happen when I completely lose it with you. Other threats I would have was, do you hear the sound of the police coming? Those sirens are here to take you away, so you need to change your behaviour. So it started off with the threats. Then it moved to the next level. It will be the slap, or the push, or the shouting at. I remember once my mother said to me, "Mary, don't touch those scissors on the side. They're really sharp." And when she left, my curious mind said, "But how sharp is really sharp?" So, to test the theory of sharpness, I picked them up and chose to cut the tablecloth. Okay, that's pretty sharp. Then went on to the shower curtain, something a bit harder, some plastic, the wooden table. You can imagine my mother's horror when she discovered all these nips in different elements and materials, and that was Mary. She needed to find out for herself. But things escalated at home to a point where Mary was too much. Mary was not good enough. So when Mary was naughty, it went from a ruler on her hand to being told off and the belt coming off and having some lashes. I remember once when I was maybe 7 or 8, my father thought that I had fed our cat. He was obsessed with our cat. I hadn't, but because I was the naughty one and he couldn't find the cat food, it had to be Mary. I can remember him chasing me down the hallway at home. I had no shoes on, a light dress, and I got to the front door and I thought, "Do you know what? I cannot take another beating." As I put my hand on the latch to open it, I heard his voice say to me, "If you leave this house, you will never be allowed in it again." And I remember as a maybe 7, 8, 9-year-old child thinking, where am I going to go? I have no shoes. So I released the door, went into the main room, stripped off my top, laid down on the floor, and the lashes started. And the key was that you didn't move, because if you didn't move, he wouldn't start counting again from 0. If you were able to hold it in and let it all go, then you could hopefully get to 10 without doing it 3, 4, 5 times. That was what being good meant for me growing up. The emotional abuse then turned to physical abuse, then turned to sexual abuse, and by the time I was 17, 18, I was raped and taken into care. The school, at that point, were obviously very fearful for my well-being, so they sent me to this therapist. And blessed therapists, this guy was lovely, and he was so well-meaning. But first of all, if you're sending a young person to therapist, don't name it the Crisis Centre in big red writing on the front of the building, okay? So, summoning courage, I went in there, and he sat down, and he had a big piece of paper, a huge thick file, and he listed off what was going to happen to me, all the bad things that were going to happen to me as a result of neglect, as a result of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. And as he went through this list, and we got to the end, I remember he said to me very clearly, "Mary, I know you're in serious trouble because you haven't shed a tear all the way through this." What he didn't understand in that moment is I had already decided that was not going to be my life. I had made a choice. I didn't know where that had come from, and trust me, the journey afterwards was incredibly messy. But I will never forget that in that moment, I was aware of the power of choice. So I didn't shed a tear because I didn't believe that that was the person I was going to go on to be. So what are the lessons that I've lived and realized and gained from being a failed, failing, recovering Goodist? Well, the first thing I've learned is that we are neither inherently good or inherently bad. We are just inherently human. And being inherently human means, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we encompass the narrative of both good and bad. The reason why it took so long for people to believe all the things that happened to me is because my father was the epitome of good and bad. He sang in the church choir. He was involved in the community. He was active. He worked hard to put me in a private school because he believed in education. My childhood was not all bad. We had lots of laughs. I love my brothers and sisters. We had a great time, and I have great memories. So we need to be careful when we play the narrative of good and bad that we are not biased, because we are neither inherently good or inherently bad. We are inherently human. Does that mean what happened was right? No. Does it mean that behavior like that needs to be managed? Yes. But does it mean that it gave me an opportunity to realize human potential? Absolutely. When I read about stories of Viktor Frankl and Immaculée, about how they turned incredible adversity, challenges into this amazing human quality. Viktor Frankl was in a concentration camp in the most horrific situation, and he managed to find meaning in that. He managed to transcend the story of good and bad. Immaculée was trapped for 91 days in a bathroom with 7 other people in the midst of the Rwandan genocide with all of this killing going on. And she managed to find forgiveness for the people outside the window who she knew had slaughtered her family. That is the power of human potential when we transcend this story of good and bad. Another thing I've learned is that I actually think sometimes bad things are necessary. And this can be a challenging thought. But I tell you why I believe that. Because sadly, and I say sadly, I think it is only until really bad things happen that we start to wake up to ourselves. We start to wake up to the reality of this world that we're living in, where anything is possible. And some of the bad things that are happening, we've created. Too few of us are turning away at so many of the environmental challenges that are going on because right now we don't want to change our lifestyles. But trust me, if fracking appeared in our back garden, it would soon become priority. Too few of us were mindful of how we were consuming and spending and building up debt until jobs were lost, homes were lost, livelihoods, people's lives. Then it became the #1 topic. Too few of us take care of our health until a loved one is very ill or we're diagnosed with something that has been purely related and linked to our way of living. And the sad thing is, even with all of this knowing, I still see myself in that category of the too few that are not waking up to some of these things. So are bad things necessary? I'll leave that one on the table. But sometimes I do believe it is the only way we will wake up to what is really going on. And one of the most powerful things that I really learned from this as well, as I said, is the power of choice. I actually don't believe there's any such thing as good or bad. It's a matter of perspective. My good may not be your good, and your bad may not be my bad. So if there isn't any common grounds of what good and bad means, then what are we actually working with? We're working with perspectives. We're working with conditioning. We're working with desires, identities, labels. But we are not really working with good and bad. But the plus side is that means we can move beyond that space. And this is where the really challenging thing has come in for me in terms of what it means to be a Goodist. When I go back to my dear wise friend's words, Mary, the world is not broken and nothing needs fixing. And the reason why I find that so hard is because for somebody that is really driven from this place of we have a responsibility to play our part, to believe that thought means that I need to believe that we are all perfect exactly the way we are, which means I need to start challenging my definition of perfect. Now, this doesn't mean we don't do good things in the world, of course, but if we are not connected to the whole of ourselves, which means seeing the whole of us, good, bad, beyond, the perfect, then what is it that we're actually giving? Because you can't give what you don't have. You can't be what you aren't. Too many of us are giving from a disconnected place where we feel we are helping another because they are less than. If I cannot see you as me and me as you, and know that the only thing that has separated us is the time that person was born, where they were born, and the life that they're living. That's the only thing. I could so easily have switched places. If we are not equal in that space of so-called giving, then that's not giving or doing good. That's judging. Conscious or unconscious, that's all it is. So for me, as a recovering Goodist, what I want to finish off saying is that I won't move away from movements and causes. However, what I will say is I'm choosing a new movement and I'm choosing a new course. And that movement and course is about being my whole self. It's about connecting to me and learning to see the perfect within me, which will enable me to see the perfect within the world around me. And from that place, I know anything I do will be of service. So I want to thank you and say, my name is Mary Daniels, and I'm happily a failed Goodist.